Hello, my name's Toby Green, and I am Senior Lecturer in Lusophone African History and Culture here at King's College London in the departments of History and of Spanish, Portuguese and Latin American Studies. I'm a historian of pre-colonial West Africa and the areas of pre-colonial West Africa which were most connected to Portuguese areas of history and contact with Africa. From around the 13th century to the 18th century, late 18th century. That's my area of expertise. And today I'm going to talk especially about that region of the world and an element of that history which I think is very little known, but is actually very important for thinking through the crisis in which we currently are experiencing. And that is to do with the economic history of that part of the world. That was the subject of a recent book I wrote, A Fistful of Shells. And that book looks at the interactions between the economic history of this part of West Africa over this pre-colonial period and of world economic history and the accumulation of surplus and capital in the Western world, which led to investment catalyzing the Industrial Revolution, and how those two were interconnected. Because for centuries in history and in the field of economics in particular, Africa was completely written out of any idea of economic history. The idea that there was indeed a relevant and valid and important African economic history is something which, until recently even, is little discussed in the major textbooks, in the major works of economic history, if you look at them. For example, Thomas Piketty's book Capital, a very famous book published a few years ago. There are 2 pages on Africa in that very long book. And this is a feature you will find in many books on economics. And so what I'm going to do is try and just put shine a little light onto an aspect of that which I think is very relevant to today. One of the things which my book looks at is the way in which over this long period of time a dependence emerged, a relationship emerged, dependent on external demand for economic transformation in many ways in West Africa, and the way in which in the long term this led to growing inequalities in levels of capital, enabling investment, comparing West Africa to the rest of the Western Hemisphere. And that meant that there wasn't the finance and capital there to invest in new industries in the 19th century when the Industrial Revolution was taking shape. It's not that many of the technologies didn't actually exist in Africa. In fact, they did. There were manufacturing of a variety of things: soap, guns, ink, all kinds of things were being manufactured in West Africa in the late 18th and 19th century, but the capital wasn't there to make the development of those industries profitable. And so one of the things that I'm interested in is why that happened and how that happened. And of course, this is very relevant, this process of capital accumulation in the West on the one hand, economic underdevelopment on the other, and also this dependence on external demand in the African economy is very relevant to today. Of course, that process merely accentuated during the colonial era in the late 19th, 20th centuries. Demand for Africa's resources, as we all know, and that's, of course, accelerated even further in the post-colonial era. In terms of economic balance sheets, Africa is not a very diverse teeming continent with lots of important and potentially transformative technologies, but it is diamonds, minerals, oil. That is how it is seen, resources and resource base. And of course, when the demand for those resources collapses, as it is at the moment, the potential, the economic impact in Africa is that much more severe, because there is over 500 years this process has emerged where external demand drives the economy and internal demand cannot simply substitute and replace that external demand. Which is why the COVID economic crisis is so much more severe and so much more drastic in Africa. And in fact, I had an email yesterday from a friend in Ghana who said, that while COVID hadn't been nearly as bad as has been predicted by Western experts, we have been put back many decades in terms of economy and society by what has happened. And that is the really drastic COVID impact in Africa. And these relationships, these economic relationships, link to the economic processes which I'm talking about over a long period of time. And this is very important for understanding Africa today, and also for understanding Africa in the past. And so just to conclude this little talk, I'm going to just talk of one region and show you how looking at that region can shine a light into different aspects of this, because of course it is a history of unequal exchange. On the other hand, it is also a history of African technologies and the importance of those in driving global economic transformation. So let's look at the Gold Coast, as it was called in the earlier times, now Ghana. I was just talking about a friend I was talking to there yesterday. And the Gold Coast was the centre and the heartland from which gold was mined, which first of all transformed North African economies. It provided the gold which drove economic expansion in North Africa in the 13th, 14th and 15th centuries, and also in fact provided the gold which produced the coinage of Spain, the Maravedi, which was derived from a coin minted in North Africa with West African gold. And those technologies allowed deep level mining in what's now Ghana at really a very early time, and those were African technologies. So from this point of money and transformation, those skills remained always valuable to the transformation of the global economy. So when in the late 17th century, in 1694, there was a huge gold strike in Brazil, in the area which is now called Minas Gerais, those technologies were very much in demand. And in fact, the transatlantic slave trade from Brazil at that time, as the historian Carlos da Silva Jr. has recently shown, and Carlos in fact worked at King's a few years ago on a project which I was involved in, as Carlos has shown, there was actually a strong demand in Brazil for Africans from this region of the Gulf Coast who had those mining technologies. So those skills remained important in the mining of gold and in the production of huge amounts of gold, which transformed the amounts of capital available in the 18th century and laid the foundations of the Industrial Revolution. And the legacy of those skills are also very much with us now, and I'll finish with talking about gold weights, the Akan gold weights. Now, these gold weights can be found in all shapes and sizes. They were carved, beautifully carved, in different forms related to the beliefs of the Akan people of the Asante Empire, the Empire of Gold, in what is now Ghana. And there are so many of these gold weights that one specialist collector, in a book which he wrote on quite recently, Tom Phillips, estimates that in his lifetime he has handled over 1 million of these gold weights. So the extraordinary creativity which is present within this history of gold, brief history of gold in Ghana, is also there in the sculptural creativity, the way in which gold was measured and weighed and became such an important part of Akan life in Ghana as well. So in that little history and snapshot, we have both the importance of African technologies, the importance of those technologies to driving the Industrial Revolution, even within the unequal structures which I've described, and the material objects which remain from that to this day, which can remind us of the creativity of those times and people, and also help us to think about how some of those inequities today might be redressed. Thank you.